Sometimes the most heartbreaking reunions are the ones that come too late. For aging rancher Elias Thorne, facing foreclosure on his family's hard-won land, that bitter truth hits harder than any fierce Montana storm. Riding home at dusk, Elias encounters a riderless mustang, crying in distress, refusing to leave a weathered saddlebag lying in the dust. Inside, he finds a bundle wrapped in his late wife's quilt, stacks of cash, and a letter from Julian, the son who vanished 10 years ago. Julian had found success as a prospector and was riding home to pay off his father's debts and ask for forgiveness. But if the money made it here and the horse is alone, where is Julian now? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Thorne Ranch had stood against Montana winters for 3 generations, its weathered buildings bearing witness to more than a century of struggle and survival. 400 acres of high country stretched from the base of the Bitterroot Mountains down through creek-fed meadows where cattle grazed on native grasses that had sustained herds since Elias's grandfather first drove stakes. Into this land in 1891. The old man had been a homesteader with nothing but determination and a wife willing to share his dream. Together they'd built something that mattered, something that lasted. Elias Thorne, at 67, understood the weight of that legacy more acutely now than ever before. He stood on the porch of the ranch house his grandfather had built, one hand wrapped around a chipped coffee mug, the other touching the simple gold band that hung from a chain around his neck. Martha's wedding ring. She'd worn it for 42 years before cancer took her 5 years ago, and Elias hadn't managed a single day without carrying it close to his heart. The morning sun painted the distant peaks in shades of amber and rose, the same view that had greeted his grandfather every dawn. The same view that Martha had loved, often standing right where Elias stood now, her hand in his, both of them silent in the way that long-married couples can be communicating everything without words. He missed that silence, almost as much as he missed her voice. The ranch house itself showed its age in honest ways. Paint peeled from window frames, despite Elias's annual attempts to maintain it. The porch boards creaked under his boots, familiar music he'd heard all his life. Inside, the rooms remained much as Martha had left them. Her cookbook still lined the kitchen shelf, her reading glasses perched on the end table beside the chair where she'd spent evenings working on quilts. Elias couldn't bring himself to change anything. Some men might call it living in the past. He called it honoring a promise. The ranch's struggles, however, couldn't be ignored with sentiment alone. The cattle operation that had sustained 3 generations now barely broke even. Feed costs had risen steadily, while beef prices stayed flat. Equipment that should have been replaced years ago limped along with Elias's stubborn mechanical skills and prayers to machinery gods he didn't quite believe in. The bank statements he kept in Martha's old desk drawer told a story of slow decline each month, chipping away at reserves, each unexpected expense pushing him closer to a cliff's edge he could see approaching but couldn't seem to avoid. 3 weeks ago, the letter had arrived. Official bank stationery, Marcus Gaines's signature at the bottom. Foreclosure proceedings would begin in 90 days unless the outstanding debt of $47,000 was settled in full. No payment plans, no extensions. Gaines had made that perfectly clear during their tense meeting in his office, where the banker sat behind a massive desk in a suit that probably cost more than Elias earned in half a year. "It's just business, Thorne," Gaines had said, not meeting Elias's eyes. "The bank can't carry non-performing loans indefinitely. You understand." Elias had understood, all right. He understood that Gaines saw an old man alone, a ranch slowly failing, an opportunity to acquire prime land at distressed prices. He understood that 3 generations of Thorne blood and sweat meant nothing against the cold mathematics of a ledger book, but understanding didn't make acceptance any easier. His daily routine had become a form of meditation, each familiar task a way of holding on to what remained. Before dawn, he'd wake in the bed he'd shared with Martha, her side still untouched, still somehow carrying her scent in his memory, if not in reality. Coffee brewed in the same pot they'd received as a wedding gift, strong and black because Martha had always said weak coffee was an insult to the beans. Then out to the barn, where 4 remaining horses waited for their morning feed, down from the 20 the ranch had kept in better years. The work was honest and hard. Checking fence lines across 400 acres took most of a day. Cattle needed counting, health checks, occasional doctoring. Hay needed cutting and baling in summer, distributing in winter. Equipment required constant maintenance. The garden Martha had planted, Elias kept it going, growing vegetables he mostly gave away to neighbors because cooking for one felt like admitting defeat. His closest neighbor, Walt Drucker, lived 5 miles east on a smaller spread. Walt was 72, a widower himself, a man who understood grief without needing to discuss it. They'd share coffee sometimes, talk about weather and cattle prices, play chess on Walt's porch while the sun set. Walt knew about the foreclosure. He'd offered money, which Elias had refused. A man didn't borrow from friends when he couldn't promise repayment. The town of Copper Ridge lay 12 miles south, a collection of buildings that had grown up around the railroad spur and slowly declined as the trains stopped coming. Population maybe 800 on a generous count. Sarah Chen ran the medical clinic, a sharp woman in her 50s who'd lost her own husband 4 years back in what everyone called a riding accident. Elias sometimes wondered if Sarah's dark eyes held the same loneliness his own did, but he'd never worked up the courage to ask. Martha had been dead 5 years, but some part of him still felt married, still felt like investigating another woman's eyes would be a betrayal. Sheriff Tom Braxton kept the peace, such as it needed keeping. Good man, fair, someone who remembered when law enforcement meant protecting communities rather than just processing paperwork. The general store still stocked supplies, though the selection grew thinner each year. The Bank Gaines's domain occupied the nicest building in town, which seemed fitting in a way that made Elias's jaw tight. But it was the memories that made the ranch both a sanctuary and a torture. Every fence post Elias passed carried a story. The north pasture, where he'd taught Julian to ride, watching his son, barely 6 years old, clinging to a gentle mare's mane with fierce determination. The creek where they'd fished together, Julian chattering about everything and nothing, while Elias taught him patience and the art of reading water. The barn loft where they'd found a nest of kittens, Julian insisting they save everyone, Martha laughing while their son named each cat after presidents. Julian had been everything, the future of the ranch, the continuation of the Thorne name, the living embodiment of Elias and Martha's love. A bright boy, quick to laugh, eager to learn. He'd grown into a strong young man, capable with his hands, good with animals, someone Elias had assumed would naturally step into running the ranch when the time came. Then Martha got sick. The cancer came fast, aggressive, the kind that modern medicine could slow but not stop. 18 months from diagnosis to grave. 18 months of watching the strongest woman Elias had ever known gradually fade, her body betraying her spirit. Julian had been 22 then, old enough to understand, young enough to be devastated in ways he couldn't articulate. The funeral had been well attended. Martha was loved in Copper Ridge, known for her kindness and her quilts, which she donated to every church fundraiser and charity auction for decades. Elias had stood at the graveside, numb, aware of Julian beside him but unable to reach across his own grief to comfort his son. They'd stood like strangers at a bus stop, close in proximity, distant in every way that mattered. 3 days after the funeral they'd argued. Elias couldn't remember who started it or exactly what was said. He remembered anger his own and Julian's years of unspoken tensions suddenly exploding. Something about the ranch, about the future, about Julian wanting to leave and Elias calling him a coward. Words meant to wound, spoken by men who didn't know how to grieve together, only how to hurt each other. Julian had packed a bag that night. "I can't stay here, Pa. Everything reminds me of her. And you You look at me like I'm failing you just by existing. Then go, Elias had said, pride and pain making him cruel. If the ranch isn't good enough for you, if your family's legacy means nothing, then go chase whatever fool dream you think is out there. And Julian had gone. That was 10 years ago. Elias had received 3 letters in the first year, postmarked from different towns. Brief notes saying Julian was okay, working various jobs, figuring things out. Then the letters stopped. Elias had written back twice, awkward attempts at apology that he'd never mailed, ashamed of his own inability to write the words that mattered. He'd told himself Julian would come home when he was ready. He'd told himself a lot of things that turned out to be lies. A man tells himself to sleep at night. Walt had asked about Julian once, early on. You hear from the boy? No, Elias had answered, the word coming out harder than intended. You try reaching out? He knows where I am. Walt had given him a look that said more than words could, disappointment mixed with understanding, the knowledge that stubbornness was a family trait Elias wore like armor. They'd never discussed it again. The thing was, Elias thought about Julian every day, wondered where he was, what he was doing, whether he was happy or safe or even alive. The not knowing was its own kind of torture. But Elias had built walls around that pain, same as he'd built walls around his grief for Martha. Strong walls, tall walls, walls that kept him standing upright and functional, but also kept him isolated and alone. Sarah Chen had called him out on it 6 months ago, after examining him for a persistent cough that turned out to be nothing serious. You're healthy enough physically, Elias, but you're dying inside those walls you've built. Everyone can see it, except you. I'm fine, he'd said. You're lonely, she'd corrected. There's a difference. He'd paid his bill and left without responding, but her words had stayed with him. Because she was right, of course. The ranch that had once felt full of life now echoed with absence. Mornings without Martha's coffee and conversation. Evenings without Julian's questions about the day's work. Nights without the sense that he was building something for someone, that his labor had purpose beyond mere survival. The foreclosure letter had almost been a relief. At least it represented a decision made for him, an ending he couldn't fight, permission to finally give up the struggle of maintaining something that maybe should have died with Martha. Let the bank have it. Let Gaines profit from 3 generations of Thorne sweat. Elias could find some small place in town, live out his remaining years without the daily reminder of everything he'd lost. But giving up, fought against something deep in his nature. His grandfather hadn't quit when drought nearly killed his first herd. His father hadn't quit during the Depression when cattle prices collapsed. The Thorne men were stubborn, it was their defining trait. For better and worse, walking away would feel like betraying everyone who'd ever worked this land. So Elias kept going, each morning rising before dawn, each day working until his body ached, each night falling into bed too tired to dream. He checked fence lines and doctored sick calves and fixed broken equipment with increasingly creative solutions. He grew vegetables and gave them away and ate simple meals in a kitchen that still smelled like Martha's cooking in his memory. He touched her wedding ring before sleep and imagined conversations they'd never have. And he tried not to think about Julian, tried not to wonder if his son ever thought about him, ever regretted leaving, ever considered coming home. Tried not to calculate that Julian would be 32 now, fully grown, possibly married with children Elias would never meet. Tried not to acknowledge the crushing weight of knowing he'd driven away the only family he had left, because pride mattered more than love in the moment when love needed to matter most. The morning he'd found the crying horse, Elias had been riding the fence line in the northeast pasture. Good day for it, clear sky, temperature mild for late September. He'd been thinking about nothing in particular, which was its own small mercy. Just a man on a horse checking his land, work he'd done thousands of times before. The sun had been setting when he started back toward the ranch house, painting the mountains in shades of copper and gold. Beautiful in the way Montana evenings often were, the kind of beauty that hurt when you had nobody to share it with. He'd been perhaps 2 miles from home when he saw the horse standing in the middle of the trail. At first, he'd thought it was one of his own that had gotten loose. Then he realized it wore a saddle and bridle he didn't recognize. A mustang, well cared for, copper-colored coat gleaming in the fading light. And it was crying low, mournful whinnies that raised the hair on the back of Elias's neck. He'd dismounted, approaching slowly with his hands visible, speaking soft words the way you do with distressed animals. The mustang hadn't shied away. Instead, it pawed at something in the dust, whinnied again, and looked at Elias with eyes that seemed almost human in their grief. That's when he'd seen the saddlebag. Weathered leather, lying in the trail like it had been dropped or thrown. The mustang kept nosing it, whinnying, refusing to leave. Elias picked it up heavy, stuffed full of something. He checked the horse first, running hands over legs and body, looking for injuries that might explain the rider's absence. Nothing. The animal was healthy, just distressed. Elias opened the saddlebag as the last light faded from the sky. Inside, wrapped in fabric he recognized immediately, was a bundle that changed everything. The quilt pattern was one Martha had favored, interlocking rings in shades of blue and cream, each stitch precise, despite being sewn by hands already weakened by illness. She'd made dozens of these quilts over the years, given most away, kept a few for the house. Elias unwrapped the bundle by lamplight in his kitchen, his hands trembling in ways that had nothing to do with age. Inside, the quilt lay stacks of bills bound with paper bands, more money than Elias had seen in years, possibly in his entire life. And beneath the money, folded carefully, a letter written on paper that showed signs of weather exposure. The handwriting was Julian's. Elias would recognize it anywhere. That careful script Martha had helped their son perfect during long evenings at the kitchen table. He made himself sit down before reading. His heart hammered against his ribs, and for a moment he wondered if this was how the end came, not with cancer or accident, but with shock delivered by mail, from a ghost. He picked up the letter with fingers that wanted to shake, smoothed it flat on the table where his family had shared thousands of meals, and began to read. Pa. It started, and Elias had to stop, close his eyes, breathe through the sudden constriction in his chest. 10 years since he'd heard that word directed at him. 10 years since he'd been anyone's father. I don't know where to start, so I'll just start with the truth. I've thought about coming home every single day since I left. Every morning I'd tell myself today's the day, and every evening I'd find another excuse to wait. Fear, I guess. Fear you wouldn't want to see me. Fear too much time had passed. Fear I'd waited too long to say the things that needed saying. But Ma didn't raise a coward, even if I've been acting like one. So here I am, or here I'll be by the time you read this, riding home with my tail between my legs and hope in my heart that maybe it's not too late for us. I need to tell you about the last 10 years. After we fought, I drifted for a while, worked ranches in Wyoming, timber operations in Washington, anything that kept me moving and too tired to think. I was running, Pa. Running from grief and guilt and the look in your eyes that told me I'd failed you just by being alive when Ma wasn't. About 5 years ago, I ended up in Idaho. Silver City area, where the old mines are playing out but a few stubborn folks keep looking. Met an old prospector named Hennessy who needed help working his claim. I figured why not hard work in isolated country sounded perfect for a man trying to outrun his demons. Turned out, Hennessy knew things about geology and mineral formations that the young miners had forgotten. He taught me to read the land, to see what the earth was trying to tell you if you paid attention. When he passed 2 years back peaceful in his sleep, which is more than most get, he left me his claim and his knowledge. Pa, I found gold. Not Hennessy's played-out silver, but a real, honest-to-God, gold vein in a section everyone else had given up on. Spent the last 18 months working it carefully, secretly, taking only what I could extract safely and selling it gradually so as not to attract attention. The kind of attention that gets a man killed in mining country. I've saved $47,000. I know that number because I know that's what you owe the bank. Called the ranch last month from a payphone, hung up when someone at the general store said Old Man Thorne wasn't taking calls. But I asked around, learned about the foreclosure from folks who didn't know they were talking to your son. The money's in this bag. Every dollar I've earned honestly. It's meant for the ranch to pay off gains, to give you breathing room, to maybe let you hire some help so the work isn't all on shoulders that have carried enough already. But more than the money, I'm bringing myself home. Bringing the apology I should have made 10 years ago. Ma died, and I blamed you for not being able to fix it, which makes me 7 kinds of fool because you were grieving just as hard as I was. We should have held each other up, Pa. Instead, we tore each other down. I've become someone I think you'd be proud of. Someone Ma would be proud of. I work hard. I keep my word. I don't owe any man anything I can't repay. I've learned things about mining and geology and business. I've saved enough money to prove I'm not just a kid running away from responsibility. But mostly, I've learned that all of that means nothing compared to what I threw away when I walked out your door. Family matters, Pa. It's the only thing that matters. I learned that too late, but maybe not too late to fix. I'll be home in 3 days. I'm riding a mustang I bought in Idaho. Good horse, strong and loyal. Named him Copper because he's the color of the ore that made my fortune. Fitting, I think. I'm scared you won't want to see me. I'm scared I've hurt you too much for forgiveness. I'm scared I'm 10 years too late and you've moved on, built a life that doesn't have room for the son who abandoned you. But Ma used to say courage isn't not being scared, it's doing what needs doing, even when you're terrified. So I'm riding home scared and hopeful and ready to spend the rest of my life making up for the years I wasted. I love you, Pa. I should have said it more when Ma was alive. I should have said it before I left. I'm saying it now, and I'll say it every day for however long you'll let me. Your son, Julian. Elias read the letter 3 times. Then he sat in the kitchen, where Martha used to hum while cooking, where Julian used to do homework while complaining about fractions, and he wept. Great heaving sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his lungs, tears that burned tracks down his weathered face. His son was alive. His son had thought of him. His son was coming home. But the horse had arrived without its rider. The money had made it here. But where was Julian? Elias forced himself to think through the fog of emotion. He examined the mustang more carefully by lantern light, checking every inch of the animal. There on the saddle, almost invisible in the worn leather, a dark stain that could only be blood, not much, but enough to turn his stomach to ice. He checked the trail with the same careful attention Julian's letter said he'd learned for reading geology. Even in darkness, Elias could see the signs, scuff marks in the dirt, places where something heavy had been dragged, multiple sets of hoofprints converging at the spot where he'd found the saddlebag. Julian hadn't dropped the money accidentally. He'd thrown it deliberately, getting it away from himself in the moments before something terrible happened. Smart thinking. The kind of quick decision that might save the money, even if it couldn't save the man. Elias calculated timelines. The letter was dated 4 days ago. Julian had said 3 days' ride. That meant he'd been taken, and Elias forced himself to use that word, taken, because the alternative was unthinkable sometime yesterday or the day before. 48 hours at most, maybe as little as 24. A man could survive a lot in 24 hours. Even injured, even captured, Julian could still be alive. The thought galvanized Elias into action. He secured the money in his safe, the one his grandfather had installed in the floor of the master bedroom. He loaded his Winchester rifle and his revolver, weapons he'd carried for decades, but never fired in anger. He gathered supplies, water, jerky, medical kit, rope, ammunition. He should call the sheriff. Tom Braxton was a good man who'd organize a proper search. But that would take time, explanations, organizing deputies, daylight hours wasted while Julian might be suffering or dying just miles away. No, this was something Elias had to do himself, had to do immediately, had to do as a father, not as a citizen trusting institutions to solve problems. He saddled his own horse, checked his gear 3 times, and secured Julian's mustang as a second mount. Copper, the horse's name, was Copper. The animal seemed to understand, standing calm, while Elias worked, whinnying only once as if to say, "Hurry." "I know, boy," Elias murmured. "I know you miss him. We're going to find him." The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, that deep blue that comes before dawn. Elias took one last look at the ranch house, his grandfather's legacy, his father's pride, the home where he'd raised his son and loved his wife. If he didn't come back, at least Julian's money would save it. Someone would find the safe eventually, pay off gains, preserve the Thorne name. But Elias intended to come back, intended to bring his son home, intended to finally say the words he should have said 10 years ago, should have said 1,000 times before then, words that came so hard to men raised to be strong and silent and proud. He mounted his horse as the sun broke over the mountains, painting the world in shades of gold and crimson. The trail led north and east toward rough country where the old mines lay abandoned and the law rarely ventured. Dangerous territory for a man his age, but not as dangerous as living the rest of his life knowing he'd let his son die without trying. Elias Thorne turned his horse toward the rising sun and began to ride. The trail led through country Elias knew from his youth, but hadn't ridden in years. Rough terrain where the foothills met the mountains proper, where pine forests gave way to rocky outcroppings and narrow defiles. This was land that punished mistakes and rewarded patience, the kind of country that separated competent riders from careless ones. He followed the tracks methodically, reading the story they told in the disturbed earth and bent grass. Julian had been riding at a steady pace, not hurrying, not aware he was being followed. Then the trail showed where other horses had joined his 3 riders, converging from different angles, boxing Julian in before he could react. The morning sun climbed higher as Elias rode, his body already protesting the pace. His back ached from hours in the saddle. His hands, gnarled by arthritis, gripped the reins with determination that bordered on stubbornness. He was 67 years old, chasing men who were likely half his age, pursuing them into territory that favored the young and the ruthless. But he'd tracked wounded elk through worse country. He'd found lost cattle in blizzards when visibility dropped to arm's length. The skills learned over a lifetime of ranching served him now reading the land, understanding how prey thought and moved, maintaining a pace he could sustain rather than burning out in desperate urgency. Around mid-morning, he found the shirt piece. It hung on a strand of barbed wire, marking an old property boundary, torn fabric fluttering in the breeze like a signal flag. Elias dismounted carefully, his knees stiff from the ride, and examined the cloth. Blue and grey plaid, the pattern familiar in ways that made his chest tight. Julian had worn shirts like this as a boy. Martha had bought them at the general store, always choosing plaids because they hid dirt and wear better than solid colours. "Growing boys are hard on clothes," she'd say, folding the shirts with the same care she brought to everything. This shirt was newer, the fabric not as faded as Elias's memory, but the pattern was identical. Either Julian still favoured the same style, or he'd deliberately chosen something that would remind him of home. Either way, the torn piece confirmed what Elias already suspected. Julian had come this way, and he'd struggled. The barbed wire was part of an old fence line that hadn't been maintained in decades. It marked what had once been the boundary of the Copper Creek Mining Company's holdings, back when silver fever had drawn hundreds of men to these hills. That was before Elias's time, even before his grandfather's. But the remnants remained rusted equipment, collapsed structures, abandoned mine shafts that made the area treacherous. Men who wanted to avoid attention often holed up in places like this. Drifters, outlaws, people with reasons to avoid towns and sheriffs. It was lawless country by default, too remote for regular patrols, too dangerous for casual visitors, too played out for legitimate mining operations. If someone had taken Julian, they'd chosen their ground well. Elias carefully pocketed the fabric piece, then studied the trail ahead. The tracks continued deeper into Copper Creek territory, following what had once been a wagon road servicing the mines. The roadbed was overgrown now, barely visible, but it offered easier passage than cross-country travel. He checked his weapons, Winchester in the saddle scabbard, revolver on his hip, and resumed riding. His mind kept returning to the letter, to Julian's words about finding gold and working honestly. In mining country, knowledge of a successful claim was a death sentence. Claim jumpers had murdered for less. If word had gotten out about Julian's find, he'd have been a marked man from the moment he started selling his gold. The thought made Elias's hands tighten on the reins. His son had spent 5 years building something, working hard, following the principles Martha had instilled in him: honesty, integrity, persistence, and it had made him a target, made him prey for men who took rather than earned. Around noon, Elias heard hoofbeats behind him. His hand went to his revolver instinctively, but he relaxed when he recognized the rider. Walt Drucker rode a sturdy sorrel gelding, his weathered face set in lines of concern and determination. He carried a shotgun across his saddle and wore the serious expression of a man committed to a course of action regardless of consequences. "Figured you might need company," Walt said as he drew alongside. "This isn't your fight," Elias replied, though relief flooded through him at seeing his friend. "The hell it isn't. Known that boy since he was born. Watched Martha raise him to be decent. If he's in trouble, it's every decent person's fight." Walt spat tobacco juice into the dust. "Besides, you always were too stubborn to ask for help. Someone's got to look out for you." They rode together in silence for a while, the comfort of shared purpose needing no words. Walt was 72, his body even more battered by years than Elias's, but he sat his horse with the ease of a man born to the saddle. They'd worked cattle together, weathered droughts together, buried their wives within a year of each other. If Elias had to ride into danger, there was nobody he'd rather have beside him. "Saw Julian in town 3 days ago," Walt said eventually. "Didn't recognize him at first. He's grown, filled out. But he had your walk, Martha's eyes. Unmistakable once I knew to look. He say anything?" "Asked directions to your place. Seemed nervous, kept checking over his shoulder like he expected trouble." Walt glanced at Elias. "You read the letter? He was bringing money, enough to save the ranch. Coming home to apologize, to rebuild." Elias's voice cracked slightly. "After 10 years of silence, he was finally coming home. Then we'll find him," Walt said, with absolute conviction. "Track him down, bring him back. Let you two have that conversation you should have had a decade ago." The trail led them into a narrow canyon where the rock walls rose steep on either side. The tracks were clearer here, pressed into softer ground near a creek bed. Multiple horses, moving in formation. Julian's mount in the center, the others flanking. They were taking him somewhere specific, not just chasing him randomly. "Professional work," Walt observed, studying the tracks. "These aren't random drifters. They planned this," which made it worse. Random violence might leave Julian injured but alive. Planned abduction meant someone wanted something information, probably, about the gold claim, which meant Julian was alive, at least until they got what they wanted. And then what? Elias forced the thought away. One problem at a time. Find his son. Everything else could wait. They made camp that evening in a protected hollow, maintaining a cold camp without fire to avoid drawing attention. Walt took first watch while Elias tried to rest, his body exhausted, but his mind racing through possibilities and fears. In the darkness, he touched the piece of Julian's shirt in his pocket and the wedding ring hanging around his neck, and he prayed to a God he'd mostly ignored since Martha died. Not for himself, he'd made peace with mortality years ago, but for Julian, for the chance to see his son again, to say the things that mattered, to rebuild what pride and grief had destroyed. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent and eternal. Somewhere under the same sky, Julian waited. Elias would find him. Failure wasn't an option when everything that mattered hung in the balance. Dawn came cold and clear, frost on the ground and breath visible in the morning air. Elias's joints protested as he saddled his horse, but he forced himself through the motions with the same determination that had sustained him through decades of ranch work. Pain was temporary. Missing this chance to find Julian would be permanent. They followed the trail deeper into Copper Creek Canyon, the walls rising higher on either side. This had been busy territory once. The old wagon road showed ruts from thousands of ore-carrying trips, and collapsed structures dotted the landscape like tombstones for dead dreams. The silver boom that built this infrastructure had ended before Elias was born, but the bones remained. Around mid-morning, they discovered an abandoned camp. The fire pit was cold, the ashes at least a day old, but signs of occupancy were everywhere. Coffee grounds in the dirt, boot prints of various sizes, and most telling fresh scrapes in the earth where something heavy had been dragged, and a pattern of disturbed ground, suggesting a struggle. "This is where they took him," Walt said, examining the scene with the practiced eye of a man who'd tracked game for 7 decades. "See here Julian's boot prints, smaller than the others. He put up a fight, got knocked down here, probably subdued." Elias knelt beside one of the impressions Walt indicated, his hand trembling slightly as he touched the ground where his son had fallen. The earth was just dirt, no different from any other patch of Montana soil, but knowing Julian had lain here made it sacred somehow. He found himself remembering another fall, decades earlier. Julian, at 8 years old, learning to ride a particularly spirited mare. The boy had been thrown, landing hard enough to knock the wind from his lungs. Elias had rushed over, fear making him rough as he checked for broken bones. "I'm okay, Pa," Julian had wheezed, trying to catch his breath. "Just got the wind knocked out." Martha had been there too, her hand on Elias's shoulder. "Let him breathe. He's tougher than you think." And Julian had proven her right, standing up despite obvious pain, insisting on getting back on the horse. "Ma says you have to get right back on or fear wins." Martha had said a lot of wise things. She'd been the emotional center of their family, the one who knew how to express feelings that Elias kept locked away. When Julian brought home his first report card, it was Martha who praised his effort and Elias who merely grunted approval. When the boy asked questions about life and death and meaning, it was Martha who sat with him for hours while Elias hid behind chores. "You're a good man," Martha had told Elias once, late at night when honesty came easier. "But you show love through work, not words. Julian needs both." "I provide for him," Elias had protested. "Teach him, guide him." "You do," she'd agreed, "but someday you'll need to tell him you love him, not just show it. Words matter, Elias, especially to children." He'd meant to do better, always meant to. But habits formed over decades were hard to break, and the words never came easily. Even after Martha got sick, even knowing their time was limited, Elias had struggled to voice the emotions that churned inside him. The day she died, Martha had gripped his hand with surprising strength. "Promise me you'll take care of Julian, not just physically, emotionally. He's going to hurt, and he'll need you to be more than just strong. He'll need you to be open." "I promise," Elias had said. But when the time came, he'd failed. Julian had needed comfort and found only silence. Needed understanding and found only expectations. Needed a father who could grieve alongside him, and found a man who'd retreated behind walls of stoic endurance. In the pocket of his coat, Elias carried a small square of fabric cut from the quilt that had wrapped Julian's money. Martha's handiwork, her pattern, her love sewn into every stitch. He touched it now, drawing strength from the tactile memory of his wife. "We should keep moving," Walt said gently, understanding that Elias needed the moment, but also knowing they couldn't afford to waste time. The trail led them toward the old Blackstone mine, the largest operation in the area before the silver ran out. Elias had explored these hills as a boy with his father, who'd been friends with some of the miners. He remembered warnings about the mine, hundreds of tunnels, many of them flooded or collapsed, all of them dangerous. "Good place to get dead, if you're not careful," his father had said. Also a good place to hide if you wanted privacy and didn't mind the risks. By mid-afternoon they could see smoke rising in the distance, a thin column suggesting a campfire, not a forest fire. Someone was ahead of them, occupying the old mining office buildings that had been abandoned for decades. "Could be innocent," Walt suggested without conviction. "Could be," Elias agreed. "But it's where the tracks lead." They approached carefully, using the broken terrain and scattered mining equipment for cover. Walt's age showed in his cautious movements, and Elias felt his own years in every step, but both men had patience born of long experience. Rushing now could get them killed, and Julian with them. From a ridge overlooking the Blackstone camp, they could see 3 men moving around the old buildings. 2 sat by the fire, relaxed and casual. The third paced, nervous energy, evident even at a distance. All 3 were armed, rifles visible, handguns holstered. "Don't see Julian," Walt whispered. "Might be inside, or in the mine." Elias studied the layout, planning approaches and escape routes with the same careful attention he brought to working cattle in difficult terrain. The sun began its descent toward the western peaks, painting the landscape in amber and shadow. They'd need to wait for darkness before attempting anything, which meant hours of watching and wondering while Julian remained out of reach. Elias settled in to wait, his hand unconsciously touching his father's pocket watch. The silver timepiece had belonged to 3 generations of Thorne men, each passing it to the next. His father had given it to him with simple words: "Time's the only thing you can't get back. Use yours wisely." He'd meant to give it to Julian on his 21st birthday, but the timing had never seemed right. Then Julian was 22, and Martha was dying, and watches seemed trivial compared to cancer. After Julian left, Elias had kept it in his dresser drawer, unable to bear the sight of something meant for a son who wasn't there. He'd brought it on this ride, though. Brought it because if he found Julian, it would finally pass to its rightful owner. And if he didn't, well, someone would find it on his body and maybe understand it mattered. The watch ticked steadily in his pocket, measuring the slow passage of seconds that separated him from his son. Each tick was a reminder that time was running out, that whatever happened next would happen soon, and that some chances only came once in a lifetime. Darkness came slowly to the mountains, the sun lingering on the peaks before finally surrendering to night. Elias and Walt remained motionless on their ridge, watching the camp below as shadows deepened and stars emerged overhead. The men around the campfire showed no signs of concern, their laughter carrying up the slope in fragments of conversation too distant to decipher. As midnight approached, Walt produced field glasses from his pack and studied the scene below with methodical attention. 3 men visible, he whispered. No sign of Julian, but that building, the old mining office, someone just carried food and water inside. Wouldn't need to do that unless they're keeping someone in there. Or in the mine itself, Elias thought. The entrance yawned like a black mouth in the hillside behind the office, timber supports still visible in the starlight. He'd explored similar mines as a boy, knew how extensive the tunnel networks could be. Julian might be imprisoned in darkness, underground, beyond easy reach. The thought made his chest tight with claustrophobic sympathy. Julian had never liked confined spaces. As a child, he'd refused to play hide-and-seek in closets, always choosing outdoor hiding spots. Martha had explained it gently. Some people just need to see the sky, to know they can move freely. Now Julian might be trapped in the earth, bound and helpless, waiting for rescue that might never come. Elias checked his father's pocket watch, midnight. The fire below had burned low, and 2 of the 3 men had disappeared into the old office building. Only one remained visible, sitting with his back against a support post, rifle across his lap. Guard duty, probably, watching for approach that they didn't expect from men of Elias's generation. "We could wait until morning," Walt suggested. "Better visibility, less chance of stumbling in the dark. Julian might not have until morning." Elias spoke the fear that had been growing all day. If they're questioning him about his claim, about the gold, once they get what they want, they'll have no reason to keep him alive. Walt was silent for a moment, then nodded. "So we go now," What's the plan? Elias studied the layout, applying decades of ranching strategy to this very different problem. You approached wild animals differently depending on the circumstances, sometimes slow and steady, sometimes with sudden, decisive action. You read the situation and adapted. I'll approach from the east, using those equipment piles for cover. Get close to the mine entrance. You stay here. With the shotgun, if things go wrong, you can cover my retreat. Elias. Walt's tone carried protest and concern. I'm not asking you to die with me if this goes bad, Elias said firmly. You've already done more than any friend should. Stay here. If I'm not back by dawn, ride for the sheriff. And leave you? And save Julian if I can't. Elias met his friend's eyes in the darkness. Someone needs to get him home safely. That's what matters. Walt struggled with this for a long moment before finally nodding. Don't make me ride back to Sarah Chen and tell her I let you get killed, you stubborn old fool. Do my best. Elias checked his weapons one final time, revolver loaded, rifle ready, knife sharpened. Tools of violence he'd never wanted to use, but would employ without hesitation for his son's sake. He thought about his father, who'd taught him to hunt and track and survive in this country. His grandfather, who'd faced down claim jumpers in the early days of the ranch. The Thorne men had never been violent by nature, but they protected what mattered. Family, land, honor, the things that made a man more than just an animal surviving day to day. Time to go. Elias murmured, more to himself than Walt. He moved down the slope with the careful patience of age, each step deliberate and measured. His knees protested the descent, but he'd learned to work through pain decades ago. The trick was accepting it without letting it control you, acknowledging discomfort while still doing what needed doing. The scattered mining equipment provided cover, as he'd hoped, rusted ore carts, collapsed sluice systems, piles of tailings left from the glory days. He moved from shadow to shadow, grateful for the moonless night, even as it made navigation treacherous. A younger man might have moved faster, but speed wasn't the advantage here. Patience was. Careful, methodical approach that didn't alert the guard or create unnecessary noise. It took him nearly an hour to cross 200 yards. By the time he reached a position near the mine entrance, his legs shook with fatigue and his heart hammered against his ribs. He allowed himself a moment to rest, to breathe, to let his body recover before attempting the final approach. The guard remained at his post, though his head nodded forward occasionally, not fully asleep, but drowsy with the boredom of night watch. Beyond him, yellow lamplight spilled from the office building's cracked windows. Voices occasionally carried out, indistinct but suggesting conversation rather than violence. Maybe Julian was still safe. Maybe they were still just questioning him, trying to pressure him into revealing the location of his gold claim. The thought offered hope, though Elias knew men's patience had limits. Eventually they'd escalate from questions to torture, from persuasion to permanent solutions. He studied the mine entrance from his position. The timber supports looked solid enough, though decades of weather had taken their toll. Inside would be darkness, possibly flooded sections, certainly unstable areas. His childhood explorations had taught him the basics of mine navigation, but this was different. This was unknown territory in hostile circumstances. A sound from inside the office raised voices, one of them younger than the others. Elias's breath caught. Was that Julian? He couldn't be certain, but the desperation in the tone suggested someone pleading, someone afraid. His hand tightened on his revolver. The weight felt wrong. He'd carried this weapon for practical purposes, mostly putting down injured animals or scaring off predators. He'd never pointed it at another human being, never pulled the trigger with the intent to kill. Could he do it now? If it came to choosing between his son's life and these strangers, could Elias Thorne become a killer? Martha's voice in his memory, "You're stronger than you know, Elias. When it matters most, you'll do what needs doing." He hoped she was right, hoped the strength to protect his son would overcome a lifetime of avoiding violence, hoped that fatherhood would prove stronger than conscience when the moment came. The guard's head drooped again, chin nearly touching his chest. Now or never. Elias gathered himself, checking his weapons one last time, touching his father's watch for luck or courage, or simply the comfort of connection to men who'd faced their own hard moments. Then he moved, a shadow among shadows, crossing the final yards to the mine entrance with his heart pounding and his hands steady. Whatever came next, he'd face it. For Julian, for family, for the chance to say the words he'd left unspoken for too long. The mine entrance swallowed Elias whole, darkness so complete it felt physical against his skin. He waited, letting his eyes adjust, listening to the sounds of dripping water and distant settling earth. The air smelled of damp rock and decay, the scent of places where sunlight never reached. Memory guided him as much as sight. He'd explored mines like this as a boy, always with his father nearby to warn of dangers. Respect the earth. His father had taught. It'll tolerate your presence, but it won't forgive carelessness. The main tunnel stretched ahead, timber supports every few yards marking the path. He moved by feel as much as sight, one hand trailing along the rough wall, testing each step before committing his weight. The sounds from outside faded quickly, replaced by the eerie quiet of underground spaces. After perhaps 50 yards, the tunnel branched. Elias paused, uncertain which direction to take, when he heard it a cough, unmistakably human, echoing from the left passage. He moved that way, his heart rate increasing with each step that brought him closer to his son. The side tunnel led to what must have been a storage chamber, one of the safe areas miners used to stockpile equipment. A faint glow illuminated the space from a lantern turned. Low enough light to see by, not enough to be comfortable. And there, bound to a support post, sat Julian. For a moment, Elias couldn't move, couldn't breathe. 10 years of absence collapsed into this single moment of recognition. His son, thinner than memory, older than imagination, but unmistakably Julian. Martha's eyes, in a face that carried the Thorne features. A man now, not the boy who'd left in anger and grief. Julian looked up at the sound of approaching footsteps, his expression moving from fear to shock to disbelief in rapid succession. His lips formed a word, "Pa," but only a whisper emerged. Elias crossed the space between them in 3 quick strides, dropping to his knees beside his son. His hands shook as he touched Julian's face, confirming reality, making sure this wasn't some fever dream born of desperation. "Pa." Julian managed again, louder this time, tears tracking through the dirt on his face. "How Copper brought the saddlebag home," Elias whispered, already working at the ropes binding his son. "Read your letter. Tracked you here." "You shouldn't have come," Julian said, even as relief flooded his features. "These men, they're dangerous. They want... I know what they want. Don't care. I'm getting you out." The ropes were well tied, professional work that wouldn't yield to simple pulling. Elias needed a knife. "Pa, listen." Julian's voice carried urgency, despite his weakened state. "There's 4 of them, not 3. One went to town for supplies, should be back soon. They'll kill you if they find you here. Let them try." The words came out harder than Elias intended, decades of repressed violence suddenly near the surface. He found his knife, began sawing at the ropes. Julian was injured. Elias could see that now. Bruises darkened his face and arms. A cut on his head had bled and dried, the source of the blood on Copper's saddle. His left hand looked swollen, possibly broken from the struggle. "I'm sorry," Julian said suddenly. "For everything. For leaving. For the things I said." "Stop," Elias's voice cracked. "You're not apologizing right now. We're saving that conversation for when we're home safe. But if something happens, nothing's going to happen." The ropes finally gave way. Julian slumped forward, and Elias caught him, holding his son for the first time in a decade. The embrace felt awkward and necessary, years of separation making simple affection complicated. Julian pulled back slightly, looking at his father with eyes that held both hope and pain. "I tried to come home sooner. Every year I'd plan it, and every year I'd lose my nerve. Thought maybe you'd moved on, didn't want to see me." "Never moved on?" Elias managed. Every day I looked down that road, hoping you'd come back. A sound from the main tunnel, footsteps approaching. They both froze, Elias's hand going to his revolver. Julian spotted something on the ground, grabbed it quickly, and stuffed it into his boot before Elias could see what it was. The guard from outside entered the chamber, lantern held high. For a moment he stared in confusion at the scene, the old man, the freed prisoner. Then his hand went for his gun. Elias was faster. The revolver came up smooth, all those years of practice on targets translating to this moment. "Don't," he said simply. The guard hesitated, measuring odds. Young man, maybe 30, with the hard eyes of someone who'd done violence before. His hand still hovered near his gun. "Walk away," Elias continued. "Pretend you never saw us. By the time you raise the alarm, we'll be gone." The guard smiled, a humorless expression. "You won't make it 10 yards. This place is a maze. And Jake, that's our boss. He doesn't let people walk away from his business." "Then I guess we have a problem," Elias said quietly. The guard went for his gun. Elias fired. The sound was deafening in the confined space, echoing off rock walls until it seemed like a dozen guns had discharged. The guard dropped, clutching his shoulder, his weapon clattering to the floor. Not a killing shot, Elias had aimed for the shoulder deliberately, some part of him still unwilling to cross that final line. "Can you walk?" Elias asked Julian, already helping his son to his feet. "I can run if I have to." Julian was unsteady but determined, leaning on his father for support. They moved quickly now, urgency replacing caution. The gunshot had announced their presence more effectively than any alarm. Within seconds, shouts echoed through the mine, men calling to each other, organizing a response. Elias led them back toward the entrance, using memory and instinct. Julian stumbled once, and Elias caught him, the reversal of their old relationship striking him even in the midst of danger. How many times had he caught Julian as a boy, learning to walk, to run, to navigate a world full of obstacles? Now Julian was the one who needed catching, and Elias was here to do it. They emerged into the night to find chaos. Walt had opened fire from his position on the ridge, shotgun blasts keeping the remaining men pinned behind cover. The diversion had worked. The gangsters were focused on the external threat, not watching the mine entrance. "This way," Elias hissed, supporting Julian as they moved toward where the horses waited. Behind them, angry voices and gunfire. Ahead, Walt's covering fire and the promise of escape. They ran, or rather, Elias ran, while Julian limped beside him, both men pushing aging bodies beyond comfortable limits because the alternative was death or capture. They reached the horses with bullets whining past them. Elias practically threw Julian onto Copper, the mustang, recognizing his master and standing steady despite the chaos. Walt appeared moments later, running despite his 72 years, shotgun empty but having served its purpose. "Ride!" Walt shouted. "I'll follow." And they rode, crashing through brush and darkness, trusting the horses to find their footing, putting distance between themselves and the men who wanted Julian dead. Behind them, shouts and pursuit. Ahead, uncertain escape and the desperate hope that they'd bought enough time. They rode hard through the darkness, branches whipping at their faces, rocks threatening to trip the horses with every stride. Elias focused on keeping Julian in the saddle, staying close enough to catch him if the injured man started to slip. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit gradually faded. Either they'd outdistanced their attackers, or the gang had decided chasing armed men through treacherous terrain in darkness wasn't worth the risk. After an hour, Walt signaled a halt in a protected hollow where a creek provided water and thick pines offered concealment. Julian nearly fell from his saddle, and Elias caught him again, lowering his son gently to the ground. "Let me see that hand," Elias said, examining the swelling by moonlight. "Probably broken, though not displaced enough to need setting." Julian's other injuries were painful but not life-threatening: bruises, cuts, the head wound that had already stopped bleeding. "I'm okay," Julian insisted through gritted teeth. "We need to keep moving. We need 5 minutes," Walt countered, already tending the horses. Animals are blown. We ride them to death. We're walking out of here." While Walt worked, Elias finally asked the question that had been burning in his mind. "What did you take from the chamber? Before the guard came in, you grabbed something and hid it." Julian hesitated, then reached into his boot and withdrew a leather-bound journal. "My prospecting notes. Records of the gold claim. Everything I've found." Also, he opened it to show pages at the back filled with writing. "Letters I wrote you over the years. Never sent them, but I kept writing. Needed to feel like I was still talking to you, I guess." Elias took the journal with hands that trembled. He couldn't read the entries in the darkness, but knowing they existed, knowing Julian had maintained that connection, even across the silence, made his throat tight with emotion. "We'll read them together," Elias promised. "At home, with time to do it right." They resumed riding after the brief rest, moving more carefully now, following game trails and creek beds that left minimal tracks. Dawn was perhaps 2 hours away when Walt suddenly grabbed Elias's arm. "Riders ahead," he whispered, "coming this direction." They melted into the shadows, hands on weapons, watching the trail ahead. 2 horses appeared, moving at a steady pace, confident riders who knew where they were going. As they passed through a patch of moonlight, Elias recognized one of them, Jack Morrison, assistant to Marcus Gaines at the bank. What was Morrison doing out here in the middle of the night, riding with outlaws? Elias made a decision in seconds. "Wait here with Julian," he told Walt, then moved to follow the riders at a careful distance. Morrison and his companion rode directly to the Blackstone camp. Elias positioned himself near the old mining office, close enough to hear when Morrison dismounted and entered the building. Voices carried through the thin walls, Morrison's educated tones mixing with rougher speech. "Gaines is getting impatient," Morrison was saying. "You've had the Thorne kid for 2 days. He tell you where the claim is yet?" A different voice, older, gravelly, probably the leader. "Jake's working on him. Kid's stubborn, but he'll break. He better break soon. Gaines wants this handled quietly. No witnesses. The old man's probably missed the kid by now. Could complicate things. Let the rancher search." The gravelly voice said, "We'll handle both of them when the time comes. 2 bodies in a mine, collapse, tragic accident. No questions." Elias's blood ran cold. This wasn't random. The banker, Marcus Gaines himself, had orchestrated Julian's abduction. "What about the money the kid was carrying?" Morrison asked. "Gone. Horse must have run off with it during the ambush. Doesn't matter, once we have the claim location, we'll take everything. Gaines gets his land, we get the gold. Everybody wins, except the Thornes." Morrison laughed, a sound without humor. "Gaines has been very patient with this property. Years of setting it up, manipulating the loans, waiting for the right moment. Would be a shame if the old man somehow saved the ranch now." "Won't happen," the other man assured him. "We've eliminated obstacles before. Remember Patterson? That rancher 2 years back, who wouldn't sell? And the Chen woman's husband. These accidents are becoming quite profitable." Elias forced himself to remain still, to keep listening, even as rage built in his chest. Gaines hadn't just targeted the Thorne ranch. He'd been murdering people for years, taking their land through fraud and violence. He needed evidence. Needed proof that would stand up in court, that would bring Gaines and his accomplices to justice. He carefully moved closer to a window, peering inside where Morrison had placed a leather satchel on a table. The gang leader, Jake, apparently was examining papers Morrison had brought. "Here's the foreclosure notice for the Thorne place," Morrison said. "Dated and signed by Gaines himself, with his personal notes about the property's real value." "Why would he write this down?" Jake asked, skeptically. "Because Gaines is meticulous, keeps records of everything. His ledger books are works of art. Every fraudulent deal, every payoff, every arranged accident." Morrison smirked. "He thinks documentation proves he's untouchable. Man's got friends in the territorial government. Those documents in the satchel right there would be enough to expose everything." But how could Elias get them? The answer came from an unexpected source. A distraction. One of the gang members burst into the office. Jake, the old man and the kid they got away, shot Tommy in the shoulder and ran. Walt Drucker was with them, providing covering fire. Jake's face darkened with rage. How long ago? Hour, maybe 90 minutes. Then they're not far. Get everyone up. We're going after them now, while the trail's fresh. Morrison looked nervous. Maybe we should let them go. Old man's got the kid back, might be satisfied with that. They heard too much, Jake said flatly. They know about the operation. We don't have a choice. The men began preparing to ride, gathering weapons and supplies. Elias saw his chance. When they left, the office would be empty. He could take the documents, get evidence that would prove the conspiracy. He waited, patient despite the urgency, watching as the gang saddled horses and rode out into the pre-dawn darkness. Morrison went with them, still protesting weakly about the wisdom of pursuing armed men. Only when the last hoofbeats faded did Elias emerge from hiding. The office door was unlocked. Inside, Morrison's satchel sat on the table exactly where he'd left it. Elias opened it with hands that shook from adrenaline rather than age. Papers, dozens of them. Foreclosure notices with handwritten annotations in what must be Gaines's precise script. Notes about property values and railroad routes. Letters discussing eliminating obstacles in carefully coded language, and most damning a ledger, smaller than the main bank books, listing transactions that could only be fraudulent. The Patterson Ranch, acquired after riding accident, resold to railroad for 400% profit. The Chen property. Widow, unable to maintain payments after husband's tragic death. Foreclosure completed. The Thorne Ranch. Priority acquisition, sits on planned railroad expansion route, eliminate as soon as opportunity presents. Other names Elias recognized. Other families who'd lost property to the bank under suspicious circumstances. Years of systematic theft and murder documented in Gaines's own hand. Elias took everything. Every paper, every note, the entire ledger. He stuffed them inside his coat, then added Morrison's personal papers for good measure. When authorities investigated, and they would investigate, this evidence would be irrefutable. He slipped out of the office as dawn began to paint the eastern sky. The gang was hunting him and Julian, thinking they were chasing victims. They didn't realize they just lost everything that mattered, the proof of their crimes, the documentation that would destroy them all. Elias made his way back to where Walt and Julian waited, his mind already working through the implications. This wasn't just about saving Julian anymore. It was about exposing a conspiracy that had killed innocent people, stolen land, corrupted law. It was about justice not just for the Thornes, but for everyone Gaines had victimized. "We have to get to the sheriff," he told Walt and Julian when he returned. "Not just for protection, to expose everything. Gaines isn't just a corrupt banker, he's a murderer." Julian looked at the papers Elias carried, understanding dawning. "The ambush, it wasn't random. He sent them after me, because you were bringing money to save the ranch, money that would ruin his plans to steal our land." Elias helped Julian back onto copper, but he made a mistake. He documented everything, probably thinking he was too powerful to face consequences. "Then let's prove him wrong," Walt said grimly. They rode toward Copper Ridge as the sun rose, 3 tired men carrying evidence that would shake their community to its foundations. Behind them, the gang pursued, still thinking they were hunters rather than the hunted. And ahead, justice waited if they could survive long enough to deliver it. The pursuit began in earnest an hour after sunrise. Elias heard the riders before he saw them, distant, but drawing closer, men who knew this country and tracked with purpose. The gang had discovered their office had been ransacked, their evidence stolen, and now they hunted with the desperation of criminals facing exposure. "How far to town?" Julian asked, grimacing as each of Copper's strides jostled his injured body. 12 miles as the crow flies," Walt answered. 15 by safe trails. At this pace, 3 hours minimum." They didn't have 3 hours. The gang was closing the distance, pushing their horses hard in a gamble that speed would overcome the head start. Elias made calculations they could probably reach town, but it would be close. Too close. "We need to slow them down," he said, already scanning the terrain for opportunities. The trail ahead passed through a narrow defile where rock walls rose steep on either side, a natural choke point. Walt saw it too, nodding understanding, without needing explanation. Men who'd worked cattle together for decades developed a kind of wordless communication. "Julian, you keep riding," Elias commanded. "Straight to town. Find Sheriff Braxton. Give him these papers." He pulled the documents from his coat, thrust them at his son. "I'm not leaving you," Julian protested. "You are." Elias's voice carried the same tone he'd used when Julian was a boy, the one that meant argument was futile. "You're injured, you're exhausted, and you're the only one who can get this evidence to people who can use it. Walt and I will buy you time." "Pa, this isn't a discussion, son. You ride. We'll catch up." Julian looked between the two old men, understanding finally settling on his battered features. He took the papers, securing them inside his coat. "Don't you dare die on me. Not when we just found each other again." "Wasn't planning on it," Elias said with more confidence than he felt. "Now go." Julian hesitated one more heartbeat, then turned copper and galloped toward Copper Ridge. Elias watched him go, praying this wouldn't be the last time he saw his son, but knowing some prices were worth paying if it meant Julian lived. "This is a damn fool plan," Walt observed mildly. "You got a better one?" "Nope, which is why I'm staying." Walt positioned himself behind a boulder with a clear view of the defile. "Always wanted to go out in a blaze of glory. Beats dying in bed from old age." "We're not dying today," Elias insisted, "just slowing them down." The riders appeared 15 minutes later, 4 men pushing hard, Jake in the lead with murder in his eyes. They saw the narrow passage and hesitated, professional instinct warning them of ambush. Walt made the decision for them, triggering a rock slide they'd hastily prepared. Stones tumbled down the slope, blocking the easiest route through the defile. Not impassable, but requiring time and care to navigate. Jake shouted orders, his men dismounting to clear the path. While they worked, Elias and Walt melted back through the rocks, buying Julian more time. Every minute of delay improved his son's chances. They repeated the tactic twice more over the next hour, quick harassment, minor obstacles, staying just ahead of pursuit while making the gang's progress difficult and dangerous. By the time Copper Ridge came into view in the valley below, Elias's legs trembled with exhaustion and his lungs burned from exertion his age shouldn't permit, but they'd succeeded. Julian had at least a 30-minute lead now, maybe more, enough to reach town, find the sheriff, deliver the evidence. Enough to turn hunters into prey. "Time to finish this," Elias said, checking his weapons. His revolver held 3 rounds. He'd fired one in the mine, another during the harassment tactics. Walt's shotgun was empty, but he carried a hunting rifle with a full magazine. They made their stand on a rocky outcrop overlooking the trail into town. Good defensive position, clear lines of sight, cover from return fire. If the gang wanted to reach Copper Ridge, they'd have to go through 2 determined old men who decided this was the hill worth dying on. Jake and his men appeared, their horses lathered and blown from the hard chase. They saw Elias and Walt's position and immediately took cover, professional outlaws who understood tactical situations. "Give us the papers, old man," Jake shouted. "You can still walk away from this." "Papers are gone," Elias called back. "My son has them. He's in town by now, talking to the sheriff. It's over, Jake. You just don't know it yet." Jake's response was a bullet that chipped rock inches from Elias's head. The fight was joined. The exchange of gunfire was brief but intense. Walt's rifle cracked steadily, keeping the gang pinned behind inadequate cover. Elias fired carefully, making each shot count given his limited ammunition. The gang returned fire, but their position was poor and their desperation made them sloppy. Then, from the direction of town, the sound of hoofbeats. Many horses, coming fast. Sheriff Tom Braxton arrived with 6 deputies, having been alerted by Julian. They flanked the gang's position with the practiced efficiency of lawmen who knew their work. Suddenly, Jake and his men found themselves surrounded, outgunned, facing justice rather than delivering it. "Drop your weapons," Braxton commanded, his voice carrying the weight of legal authority. "You're all under arrest for kidnapping, attempted murder, and conspiracy." Jake made the calculations quickly: fight and die, or surrender and face trial. He chose survival, throwing down his rifle. His men followed suit, understanding the game was truly over. Elias slumped against the rocks, exhaustion finally claiming him now that the immediate danger had passed. Walt sat beside him, breathing hard, looking every one of his 72 years. "We did it," Walt wheezed. "Damn fools actually pulled it off." Deputies moved forward to secure the prisoners. Braxton approached Elias and Walt, concern evident on his face. "You two all right?" "Still breathing," Elias managed. "Julian, safe in town. Handed me enough evidence to put Gaines away for 3 lifetimes." Braxton shook his head in amazement. Had suspicions about that banker for years, but never could prove anything. "What you found, it's damning. Already sent a deputy to arrest him." Elias felt something release in his chest. Tension he'd been carrying for so long he'd forgotten what relaxed felt like. Julian was safe. The conspiracy was exposed. The ranch would be saved. After so much loss and pain, somehow everything crucial had survived. "Need to see my son," Elias said, trying to stand and discovering his legs had other ideas. "Easy," Braxton said, helping him up. "We'll get you both to Doc Chen's clinic. You've earned some rest." The ride into Copper Ridge passed in a haze. Elias remembered fragments, townspeople gathering as news spread, their shocked faces as deputies led Jake's gang through the streets in handcuffs, the bank building with additional deputies standing guard. Marcus Gaines being escorted out, his expensive suit incongruous with the iron shackles on his wrists. But mostly, he remembered reaching the clinic and seeing Julian. His son stood despite obvious pain, supporting himself on Sarah Chen's arm while she tried to convince him to lie down. When Elias entered, Julian's face transformed relief and joy and exhausted gratitude all at once. They met in the middle of the clinic, embracing without words, because words weren't adequate for what needed expressing. 10 years of separation, decades of poor communication, a lifetime of love expressed through work rather than words, all of it distilled into this moment of holding his son and being held in return. "Thought I lost you," Elias managed finally. "Never," Julian replied. "I was coming home. One way or another, I was always coming home." Sarah Chen cleared her throat gently. "I need to examine both of you. Julian's hand is definitely broken, and Elias, your vital signs are concerning for a man your age who just fought outlaws for half a day." "I'm fine," Elias protested, but he let her guide him to an examination table because the truth was he felt every one of his 67 years, and quite a few extra ones besides. She worked efficiently, cleaning Julian's wounds and setting his broken hand in a splint. Examined Elias's blood pressure and heart rate, tizzing at numbers that apparently concerned her, but didn't surprise her. "You're going to rest," she ordered in the tone that made patients obey, regardless of their own wishes. "Both of you." Doctor's orders. Over the next few hours, more pieces fell into place. Federal marshals arrived, summoned by telegraph, when the extent of Gaines's crimes became clear. They took possession of the evidence, interviewed witnesses, built their case with the methodical patience of professionals who knew this would be a high-profile prosecution. Jack Morrison was arrested trying to flee town on horseback. Other conspirators were identified from Gaines's meticulous records: the corrupt county clerk who'd falsified documents, the railroad representative who'd promised kickbacks, even a deputy sheriff who'd looked the other way during suspicious deaths. The web of corruption stretched wider than anyone had imagined, touching dozens of lives across multiple counties. But it had finally been exposed, dragged into daylight where it couldn't survive scrutiny. That evening, Elias sat beside Julian's bed in the clinic, both of them too exhausted to sleep despite Sarah's best efforts. They talked quietly, filling in gaps from 10 years of separation. Julian spoke about his time prospecting, the lessons learned, the man he'd become. Elias talked about the ranch, the struggles, the loneliness that had defined his days. "I'm sorry I wasn't there," Julian said at one point. "When Ma died, when you needed me, I ran instead of staying." "I'm sorry I drove you away," Elias countered. "Should have known how to grieve without pushing away the only family I had left. Ma would have handled it better," Julian said with a sad smile. "She always knew what to say." "She did." Elias touched the wedding ring hanging around his neck. "She'd be proud of you, though. Proud of the man you became despite my failures as a father. You weren't a failure, Pa. You were grieving. We both were. We just didn't know how to do it together." Outside the clinic windows, night settled over Copper Ridge. Somewhere in the jail, Gaines and his accomplices faced the reality of justice, finally catching up to crimes they'd thought would stay hidden forever. The community buzzed with scandal and revelation, stories that would be told for generations. But in the quiet clinic room, father and son found peace in simply being together, in having survived the darkness, in facing tomorrow with hope instead of regret. 3 days after the arrests, Copper Ridge's courthouse filled to capacity for what everyone called the trial of the century. Federal Judge Harrison Caldwell presided, a stern man in his 60s who'd built a reputation for integrity during 30 years on the bench. The gallery held victims' families, curious townspeople, journalists from as far away as Helena, all of them hungry to witness justice for crimes that had festered in darkness too long. Marcus Gaines sat at the defense table in his expensive suit, now wrinkled from days in jail. The veneer of respectability had cracked to reveal something uglier underneath a man who'd built an empire on theft and murder, who'd thought wealth and connections placed him above consequence. Elias attended every day of the trial, sitting beside Julian in the front row. His son's hand was properly set now, healing in a cast that would come off in 6 weeks. The bruises had faded to yellow and green, visible reminders of how close they'd come to losing everything. The prosecution built their case methodically. Gaines's ledger was entered as evidence, each page a damning record of criminal enterprise. Property records showed the Patton ranchers facing hardship, mysterious accidents, foreclosures completed with suspicious speed, properties resold at enormous profit. Jack Morrison testified first, having agreed to full cooperation in exchange for a reduced sentence. He described years of working as Gaines's enforcer, arranging accidents, falsifying documents, intimidating witnesses. His testimony connected dots that prosecutors had suspected but never proven. "How many people died on Gaines's orders?" the prosecutor asked. Morrison's voice was flat, emotionless. "7 that I know of personally. Tom Patterson, Richard Chen, others. Anyone who stood between Gaines and property he wanted." The gallery erupted in shocked murmurs. Judge Caldwell gavelled for order, his face grave. Sarah Chen testified about her husband's death, the riding accident that had never made sense, the pressure from the bank that came immediately after. Her voice shook, but remained steady as she described losing both her husband and her home while Gaines profited. "Did you suspect foul play?" the prosecutor asked. "I knew," Sarah said quietly. "But who listens to a widow when a powerful banker says it was just a tragic accident?" Tom Patterson's widow gave similar testimony, as did other families who'd lost land to Gaines's schemes. Each story built on the last, painting a picture of systematic predation that had terrorized the community for years. Julian took the stand on the 3rd day, describing his abduction in clear, factual terms. The ambush, the interrogation about his gold claim, the threats against both himself and his father. Jake Hollis's gang had kept him prisoner, intending to torture the claim's location from him before killing him. "Why target you specifically?" the prosecutor asked. "Because I was bringing money to save my father's ranch," Julian answered. "Money that would ruin Gaines's plan to steal the property through foreclosure." The defense attorney, An overworked public defender who knew his case was hopeless tried to suggest Julian had been caught in a random criminal act, that Gaines had no knowledge of the kidnapping. But then the prosecution introduced letters found in Morrison's possession, explicit instructions from Gaines about handling the Thorne situation permanently. Sheriff Braxton testified about the arrest, about finding Gaines attempting to burn documents in his office fireplace, about the additional ledgers discovered in a hidden safe, records going back a decade showing systematic fraud. The evidence was overwhelming. Gaines's meticulous record-keeping, meant to demonstrate his power and invincibility, became the instrument of his destruction. Every crooked deal documented, every bribe recorded, every ordered death noted in careful, incriminating detail. On the fifth day, the defense rested without calling witnesses. What defense could they offer against Gaines's own records? The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, the foreman read, "We find the defendant guilty. On the charge of fraud, guilty. On the charge of racketeering, guilty." The verdicts continued, guilty on every count. 37 separate charges, 37 guilty verdicts. Gaines's face remained impassive, but his hands trembled slightly as the weight of consequences finally registered. Judge Caldwell's sentencing was swift and uncompromising. "Marcus Gaines, you exploited your position of trust to prey upon vulnerable members of this community. You ordered the deaths of innocent people. You corrupted institutions meant to protect citizens. The law allows me to show mercy. In this case, I find no reason to do so. Life imprisonment without possibility of parole, sentences to run consecutively." The gavel fell with finality. Jake Hollis and his gang received sentences ranging from 20 years to life, depending on their level of involvement. Morrison got 15 years for his cooperation. The corrupt officials faced their own reckonings, careers destroyed and prison sentences looming. But the most important outcome wasn't the sentences, it was the restoration. Fraudulent foreclosures were reversed. Properties were returned to their rightful owners or their families. The Thorne Ranch's debt was nullified entirely, the loan declared fraudulent from its inception. Elias walked out of the courthouse that final day with Julian beside him, Walt trailing behind with Sarah Chen on his arm. The community had faced its darkness and emerged stronger. Justice, delayed for years, had finally arrived. "It's over," Julian said. "It is," Elias agreed. "Now we can start living again." 6 weeks after the trial, the Thorne Ranch showed signs of genuine recovery. New fence posts stood straight and strong along the northern pasture. The barn wore fresh paint, red against the Montana sky. Cattle grazed on healthy grass, their numbers slowly increasing as Elias and Julian rebuilt the operation with careful planning and Julian's mining money. But the most significant changes weren't visible in buildings or livestock. They showed in the way father and son worked together, the easy conversation that replaced years of silence, the laughter that filled spaces where grief had lived too long. Julian had moved into his old room, though it felt different now, a man's space rather than a boy's. His prospecting journal sat on the dresser beside photographs of Martha. The quilt she'd sewn, now mended and cleaned, covered his bed, past and present woven together, creating something that honored memory without being trapped by it. Each morning they rose before dawn, shared coffee Martha's way, strong and black, and planned the day's work. Elias taught Julian the business side of ranching he'd never learned as a boy, sharing knowledge of feed costs and breeding cycles and seasonal planning. Julian brought new ideas from his years away, techniques for sustainable grazing he'd learned in Wyoming, water management strategies from his time in Idaho mining country. "We should hire help," Julian suggested one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "2 good ranch hands would let us expand the operation, maybe get into horse breeding like Grandpa did." "Can we afford it?" Elias asked, old habits of frugality dying hard. "Pa, we have money. Not just from the gold, the settlement from Gaines's seized assets. We're not rich, but we're comfortable. It's okay to invest in the future." Elias nodded slowly, adjusting to a reality where the ranch wasn't one bad season from collapse. Your grandfather would approve. He always said this land could support more than we were doing with it. They hired 2 brothers from town, young men eager for steady work. The ranch began to feel alive again in ways Elias had forgotten were possible. Voices calling to each other across the pastures, shared meals in the kitchen that had been silent for too long. The sense of building something that would last, that had purpose beyond mere survival. Walt visited regularly, often bringing Sarah Chen with him. A quiet romance had developed between the doctor and the old rancher, both of them finding companionship after years of loneliness. They'd sit on the porch with Elias and Julian, sharing stories and laughter, building the kind of community that tragedy had threatened to destroy. "You two thinking about making it official?" Elias asked Walt one evening when the women had gone inside to help with dishes. Walt smiled, a rare show of emotion from a man who kept his feelings close. "Thinking about it. Sarah's a good woman. Life's short, seems foolish to waste what time we have left." Wise words. Elias touched the wedding ring still hanging around his neck. "Martha would tell me the same thing if she could." "She'd want you happy," Walt said. "Both of you happy. You and Julian, maybe Julian, finding a good woman of his own someday." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Julian emerged from the barn leading Copper. The mustang had become his constant companion, loyal and steady, the horse that had inadvertently saved both their lives by refusing to abandon that saddlebag. "Taking Copper for a ride," Julian called. "Rebecca's meeting me by the creek." Rebecca Walsh, the schoolteacher from town. They'd been courting for a month now, tentative but genuine. A good woman, smart and kind, someone who made Julian smile in ways that reminded Elias of how he'd felt around Martha. "Don't stay out too late," Elias said, then caught himself. "Sorry, old habit. You're a grown man." "It's okay, Pa," Julian grinned. "Kinda nice having someone care about my schedule again." After he rode off, Elias sat in comfortable silence with Walt and Sarah, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. This was what peace felt like, not the absence of pain, but the presence of people who mattered, not forgetting what was lost, but appreciating what remained. Later, alone in his room, Elias took out Julian's journal. He'd been reading it slowly, savoring the letters his son had written but never sent. Each entry revealed Julian's journey from angry young man to someone seeking purpose and redemption. The words showed growth, maturity, the slow healing of wounds Elias had thought were permanent. In the final unsent letter, written just before Julian started home, his son had written, "Pa, I don't know if you'll ever read this. Don't know if you'll want to see me after all these years, but I'm coming home anyway. Because home isn't about deserving it, it's about belonging. And I belong with you, on that land, continuing what Grandpa started and you've maintained. I belong home." Elias closed the journal carefully, tears tracking down his weathered face. His son had come home. Despite everything, despite years of separation and pain, family had proven stronger than pride or grief or fear. Tomorrow they'd continue the work of rebuilding the ranch, their relationship, their future. But tonight, Elias simply gave thanks for second chances, for stubborn horses, and for sons who found their way home. 1 year after the day a crying horse changed everything, Elias Thorne rode the fence line with his son beside him. The evening sun painted the Bitterroot Mountains in shades of copper and gold, the same view that had greeted 3 generations of Thorne men. But this time, the familiar landscape felt different, not lonely, but full of promise. The ranch had transformed in those 12 months. Where struggling cattle had grazed on neglected pasture, a thriving herd now numbered over 300 head. The buildings stood solid and well-maintained, fresh paint gleaming in the fading light. New equipment sat in the barn, a tractor Julian had insisted they needed, modern fencing tools, veterinary supplies that would have seemed extravagant a year ago, but now represented prudent investment. "Remember when we couldn't afford to fix the barn roof?" Julian asked, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Remember when we couldn't afford coffee?" Elias countered. Or bullets, or hope. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the kind of quiet that didn't need filling. So much had changed, yet the essential things remained: the land, the work, the bond between father and son, now stronger for having been tested and rebuilt. Walt joined them as they approached the creek, his horse moving with the easy gait of an animal that had made this journey countless times. At 73, Walt showed no signs of slowing down. If anything, his relationship with Sarah had given him renewed energy, purpose beyond merely existing through each day. "Sarah's got dinner planned at our place tonight," Walt said. "You two are expected. She's making her famous pot roast, and she'll be insulted if you're late." "Wouldn't dream of insulting the doctor," Elias said, with a warmth that would have been impossible a year ago. Sarah had become part of their extended family, her presence in Walt's life, a reminder that second chances came in many forms. They turned their horses back toward the ranch house as the sun touched the mountain peaks. Behind them, the two hired hands, the Morton brothers, were finishing the day's work, their voices carrying across the pasture as they joked about something. The ranch felt alive in ways Elias had forgotten were possible, not just surviving, but thriving. Not just one man against the world, but a community working together. Julian had proposed to Rebecca Walsh last month. The wedding was planned for spring, a simple ceremony in Copper Ridge, with the whole community invited. Elias had given them the choice: live in town where Rebecca taught school, or build a house on the ranch property. They'd chosen the ranch, wanting to raise their future children the way Julian had been raised, connected to land and legacy. The thought of grandchildren still seemed surreal. A year ago, Elias had been alone, aging, convinced his family line would end with him. Now the future stretched ahead, full of possibilities: Julian's children, learning to ride, to work cattle, to understand the value of honest labor and connection to the earth. Fourth-generation Thorners, on land that had almost been lost forever. As they approached the ranch house, Elias noticed Copper grazing near the barn. The mustang that had refused to abandon Julian's saddlebag, that had led Elias to the truth when hope seemed lost. Julian had tried repeatedly to explain to the horse that he'd been saved, that the mission was accomplished, but Copper still followed his master everywhere, still whinnied nervously when Julian was out of sight for too long. "Loyal creature," Walt observed, following Elias's gaze. "Knows who saved his rider." "We saved each other," Elias corrected. "Copper brought me the letter. Without that—" He didn't finish. Some alternate futures were too painful to contemplate. Inside the house, Martha's presence remained in subtle ways. Her quilts on the beds and chairs, her cookbooks on the kitchen shelf, now used regularly by Julian, who'd learned to reproduce her recipes with surprising skill. Her photographs on the walls, images of a woman who'd been the heart of this family and remained so even in absence. But the house no longer felt like a shrine to the past. It felt alive, inhabited, moving forward while honoring what came before. The balance Elias had struggled to find for years had finally arrived, remembering without being paralyzed by memory, honoring Martha while still living fully. That evening, at Walt and Sarah's home, gathered around a table laden with good food and better company, Elias found himself studying the faces around him. Julian, animated as he discussed plans for the horse breeding program. Rebecca, listening with the patient attention that made her such a good teacher. Walt and Sarah, their hands occasionally touching in the unconscious way of couples comfortable with affection. Sheriff Braxton, who'd stopped by and been invited to stay, sharing news about federal investigations that continued to uncover Gaines's criminal network. This was family, Elias realized. Not just blood relations, but people who'd faced darkness together and emerged bound by shared survival. People who celebrated each other's joys and supported through sorrows. People who showed up, who cared, who made life worth living beyond mere existence. "Speech," Walt called out suddenly, raising his glass. "Come on, Elias. Year ago you got your son back, defeated a corrupt banker, saved your ranch. Got to have something to say about that." Elias stood awkwardly, uncomfortable with attention but wanting to honor the moment. He looked at Julian, at the man his boy had become, and felt words rising that had been trapped inside him for too long. "Year ago, I was alone," he began simply, "losing everything, convinced my best days were behind me. Then a horse started crying in the middle of a trail, and everything changed. Found my son, found justice, found hope." He paused, emotion making his voice rough. "But mostly I found what I'd lost when Martha died, the ability to believe life could still be good, that family mattered more than pride, that it's never too late to fix what's broken." He raised his glass to Julian. "To second chances, to stubborn horses, to sons who come home, to fathers who come looking," Julian added, his own voice thick with feeling. They drank, and conversation resumed, and the evening continued in warmth and laughter. Outside, stars emerged in the Montana sky, the same stars that had witnessed generations of Thornes working this land, the same stars that would witness generations yet to come. Later, riding home under that starlit sky with Julian beside him, Elias touched the wedding ring still, hanging around his neck. Martha's ring, but also his own, a circle representing family, commitment, love that transcended even death. "Think Ma would be proud?" Julian asked quietly. "No, she would be," Elias answered. "Proud of both of us, for finding our way back to each other, for building something that'll last." They rode the final mile in silence, two men who no longer needed words to communicate what mattered. The ranch house appeared ahead, lights burning in windows that had been dark for too long. Home, not just a place, but a feeling. Not just survival, but belonging. The long ride home was finally complete.